US President Donald Trump and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese signed a critical minerals deal at the White House on Monday.
Today, the global economy is on the verge of major changes. Against a backdrop of global tensions, growing trade wars, and climate disasters, many countries are now reviewing their strategic priorities. One of the most pressing issues facing governments is securing supplies of rare earth and mineral resources. These materials are the basis for the technologies of the future, from electronics and batteries for electric vehicles to the military industry. And for a number of countries, such as the US, this is not just an economic issue, but a matter of national security.
The $8.5 billion agreement with Australia will allow Washington to import so-called rare earths from Australia.
In recent years, global dependence on China for supplies of rare earth elements and other critical materials has become a real challenge. China controls more than 80% of the global market for rare earth elements, and in recent years we have seen increasingly tough measures from Beijing aimed at restricting exports of these materials. But what if one of the world's largest economies, the US, decides to change its strategic focus and find alternative sources? What if other countries, such as Australia and Canada, become key partners? The answer to this question is no longer just theoretical. In recent months, the US and Australia have signed an important agreement that could change the balance of power in the global rare earths market. The agreement provides for enhanced cooperation in the extraction and supply of strategic materials. But what is behind this move? How will it affect the economies and politics of the US, Australia, and of course China? And how might this alliance influence the future of global supply chains?
And joining me to discuss this more is DW China analyst Clifford Coonan. Clifford, what exactly are rare earths and why are they so important?
If you think this is just another economic agreement, you are sorely mistaken. Behind this agreement lie far-reaching plans to reduce dependence on China, as well as a desire to create new geopolitical and economic realities that could change the global trade landscape. The more the US secures rare earth and mineral resources for itself and its allies through reliable partners, the more difficult it will be for China to maintain its position in global markets. However, this does not mean that the US and Australia will be able to easily replace China in this regard. First, there are not only economic but also environmental and technological challenges on the path to independence. Second, how will China respond to such moves? We have already seen how it has used its monopoly on rare earth elements as a political weapon. What will happen if this strategy becomes even more aggressive? Today, we will try to understand what is behind the agreement between the US and Australia, how it will affect the global market for rare earth elements and mineral resources, and what will happen to the global economy if this struggle for resources escalates into a real economic war.
Currently, China is the world's largest exporter of critical minerals, which are needed in everything from fighter jets and electric vehicles.
In recent decades, rare earth and mineral resources have acquired the status strategic materials that play a decisive role in the global economy. These elements are not just of scientific interest, but are the basis for the most advanced technologies. They are essential for the production of electric vehicles, energy storage batteries, solar panels, mobile phones, computers, and even military technology. But it is rare earth elements that have become most important in recent years as countries have begun to transition to green energy, and high technology has become a critical component of national security. The role of rare earth and mineral resources in the global supply chain has grown dramatically in recent years. More and more countries are beginning to realize that dependence on a limited number of suppliers could become critical to their development and security. This raises an important question: who will control these resources in the future, and what risks could this pose to global stability?
They're emerging now as the main weapon in the US-China trade war, so that's why they're significant. And what they are, they're called rare earths, they're often not rare.
The greatest concern is dependence on a single player, China. For more than 2 decades, China has dominated the rare earth elements market. Today, it controls about 80% of global production of rare earth materials, and its influence in areas such as magnesite, tungsten, and lithium production cannot be overstated. This allows China not only to influence the global market, but also to use its resources as a tool for political pressure. In 2010, for example, Beijing cut rare earth element supplies to Japan amid territorial disputes in the East China Sea, demonstrating its ability to use resources as a geopolitical weapon. This event was a turning point for many countries, which realized that dependence on a single supplier, especially one with the scale and ambitions of China, is fraught with risk. The rare earth elements market has become an important indicator of how the global economy responds to changes in international relations and the domestic needs of countries. The issue of dependence on China has become particularly relevant for the US, which has played a leading role in the global economy for decades, as well as for its allies around the world, such as Japan, South Korea, and EU countries. Despite having vast reserves of rare earth resources on its territory, the US cannot extract them efficiently due to environmental and technological constraints. As a result, it is completely dependent on China for supplies of these materials. This dependence has proved excessive in the context of global political tensions and growing competition in high technology.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
However, after a series of crises, such as the trade war with China and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, the US decided to change its strategy on securing its supply of rare earth materials. This has been made possible by the development of new extraction and processing technologies, as well as increased cooperation with allies such as Australia, Canada, and some African countries. The US has begun to actively invest in developments aimed at diversifying its supply of rare earth materials. At the same time, it is strengthening political and economic ties with a number of countries, which should not only ensure security of supply but also create new trade routes. It is in this context that the recent signing of an agreement between the US and Australia should be viewed, which was an important step in the fight for rare earth resources. This agreement aims to develop the extraction and processing of strategic materials such as lithium, rare earth elements, and other critical minerals. At first glance, it may seem like just another economic agreement, but behind it lies a much deeper geopolitical strategy, the goal of which is not only to strengthen bilateral economic relations, but also to fight for independence from China.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Australia, with its significant reserves of rare earth elements and other mineral resources, is one of the most important players in the global market. But despite its significant potential, Australia has long remained a minor supplier against the backdrop of Chinese dominance. The situation changed after Australia began to actively promote its mining industry, improving infrastructure and attracting foreign investors, including American companies. This cooperation has become not only an economic but also a strategic move for the US, which sees Australia as a reliable partner capable of helping to strengthen its position in the global market for rare earth elements and other materials necessary for the green economy and the defense industry. The new agreement between the US and Australia is primarily focused on establishing a strong supply of lithium, rare earth elements, and other minerals needed to produce batteries for electric vehicles and high-tech devices. Thanks to its rich natural resources, Australia can provide the US and other allies with a stable supply of these materials, reducing their dependence on China. However, behind this simple economic agreement lies a serious strategic calculation related to strengthening control over key technologies and reducing China's influence in the global economy.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
One of the key points of this agreement is the creation of joint projects for the development and processing of rare earth materials, which will give the US and Australia control over the high-tech part of the market. This also means a significant reduction in the risks associated with possible political or economic shocks that could occur in the event of a deterioration in relations with China. It is important to note that all this is happening against the backdrop of a global transition to new technologies, solar batteries, electric vehicles, the latest batteries, and military equipment where rare earth elements play a crucial role. Given that China remains one of the main suppliers of these materials, the conclusion of such an agreement between the US and Australia marks the beginning of serious changes in the global economy that could significantly affect the distribution of economic and political power on the international stage. Thus, the agreement between the US and Australia is not just an economic deal, but an important step in the US's efforts to reduce its dependence on China and strengthen its position in key markets, thereby ensuring its security and control over the resources necessary for the technologies of the future.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Over the past few decades, China has established a virtual monopoly on the rare earth elements market, which allows it not only to control critical global supply chains, but also to use these resources as a tool for political pressure. It is the world's largest supplier of rare earth elements, which play a key role in the production of high-tech devices such as smartphones, computers, electric vehicles, and energy storage systems. Chinese companies control more than 80% of global rare earth production, giving Beijing unlimited opportunities to manipulate supplies and prices, affecting strategically important industries in many countries. This control has become not only an economic, but also a political lever that China actively uses to strengthen its global position. One striking example of the use of this leverage was the restriction of rare earth element supplies to Japan in 2010 amid a diplomatic crisis. This event demonstrated how vulnerable countries that are heavily dependent on Chinese supplies can be. Japan, one of the largest electronics manufacturers, found itself in a crisis situation when China literally stopped exporting rare earth materials for a month, leaving Japanese companies without key components for the production of high-tech products. This incident caused great concern in Japan and became an important lesson for many countries, including the US and the EU, which began to look for ways to diversify their supplies. However, despite the obvious risks, the US remained dependent on Chinese imports of rare earth elements for a long time, which posed a threat to national security, especially in the context of global change and technological competition. For decades, the US tried to solve this problem, but only in recent years has the situation begun to change. This was due to a number of factors, including increased geopolitical tensions, not only with China but also with a number of other countries, as well as the growing importance of rare earth elements for new technologies. The emergence of green technologies, solar panels, batteries for electric vehicles, and energy storage has presented world powers with the challenge of not only securing their economic interests, but also protecting their environmental and energy ambitions. In addition, China is strengthening its control over key areas such as battery and electronics manufacturing every year, which increases its importance as a global economic and political player.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
One of the steps taken by the US to reduce its dependence on China was to establish closer economic and political relations with Australia. With its significant reserves of rare earth and mineral resources, Australia has been recognized as an important strategic partner in securing supplies of critical materials. With its vast deposits of lithium, magnesite, tungsten, and other strategic minerals, Australia could become a serious alternative to China for the US and other Western countries. However, Australia has long been unable to realize its potential due to its underdeveloped mining and processing infrastructure. In addition, Australian industry was under pressure from the Chinese market, which purchased a significant portion of the country's resources. Nevertheless, the situation has changed dramatically in recent years, influenced by growing geopolitical tensions, particularly in relations with China. Australia has begun to actively develop its mining industry, attracting foreign investors and establishing close cooperation with the US. The construction of new mines, the expansion of rare earth element processing, and the creation of infrastructure for their transportation and processing have all become part of Australia's long-term strategy to strengthen its role in the global rare earth materials market. In this way, Australia is becoming not only an economic, but also a geopolitical partner of the US in the struggle to reduce dependence on China.
And that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
It is in this context that the recent signing of an agreement between the US and Australia should be viewed. which should be an important step in diversifying sources of rare earth elements. Under the terms of the agreement, Australia will provide the US with a stable and reliable supply of lithium, magnesite, rare earth elements, and other critical minerals that will be used in the production of batteries for electric vehicles and solar panels. This alliance aims to create sustainable supply chains that will not depend on the whims of China. Moreover, cooperation between the US and Australia in the field of high technology and battery production will allow both countries to strengthen their positions in the green economy, which will develop rapidly in the coming decades. It is worth noting that the agreement between the two countries not only concerns the economic sphere, but is also largely related to security issues. Australia, thanks to its geographical location and rich natural resources, is becoming an important link in the global network that ensures the security and sustainability of supply chains. For the US, this cooperation is particularly important in the context of growing Chinese aggression in the field of technology and rare earth element mining. The signing of this agreement is a step aimed at reducing the risks associated with dependence on a single player in the rare earth materials market.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
However, despite all the advantages, the process of diversifying supplies and expanding partnerships with Australia is fraught with certain problems. First, the extraction and processing of rare earth elements requires significant capital investment in infrastructure, which has become a serious challenge for Australia. Second, severing traditional trade ties with China could cause economic difficulties and political reprisals from Beijing. For example, China could apply pressure by raising tariffs on other products or restricting supplies of other strategic resources, such as oil, gas, or agricultural products. In addition, Australia must address issues related to the environmental sustainability of rare earth element mining and processing. Against the backdrop of global efforts to protect the environment, the development of new mining and processing methods must be as environmentally safe as possible to avoid negative impacts on the ecosystem. Nevertheless, the agreement between the US and Australia opens up new opportunities, not only for both countries but also for other partners around the world. In the context of growing competition for rare earth elements and high-tech materials, alliances of this kind are becoming key to ensuring the stability of global supply chains and protecting national interests.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The global economy is on the verge of profound change, and one of the key issues that world powers will have to address in the coming decades is the balance of supplies of rare earth elements and mineral resources. These materials are essential for the transition to green energy, the development of new technologies, and of course the strengthening of national security. However, many countries, especially the US, face the problem of heavy dependence on China, which, controlling a significant share of global supplies, effectively dictates the terms of the game in this market. The signing of the agreement between the US and Australia was an important step towards diversifying the supply of rare earth elements, which in turn should reduce dependence on China. This is not just an economic agreement, but a whole strategy aimed at redistributing global supplies and resources, which will also create new economic and political realities. However, the path to independence from China will not be easy. If the US and Australia can establish successful cooperation, it will not only enable them to become independent of Chinese supplies, but also provide significant political dividends. Strengthening this alliance could also be a catalyst for other countries, such as Canada, Japan, and European countries, which, like the US, are seeking to reduce their dependence on China for critical materials.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Reducing China's influence in this context is not only an important economic factor, but also a strategic one. China continues to use its monopoly on rare earth elements as a powerful lever of pressure. Not long ago, China announced its intention to increase control over lithium mining, which caused a sharp increase in prices for this element on world markets. This measure was likely a response to growing pressure from the US and its allies, who have begun to seek alternative suppliers. However, unlike China, the US and Australia, in their quest for independence, will have to find ways to extract and process these materials with minimal environmental risks. This presents a number of challenges, including the need to improve processing technologies and develop new environmentally friendly extraction methods.